In the summer of 2023, a grey seal hauled itself out of the Thames and onto a sandbank below London Bridge. This is not remarkable anymore. Seals have been coming back to the Thames since the 1990s. The Port of London Authority records roughly 3,000 sightings a year. They show up near Teddington, around Greenwich, under Tower Bridge. They are there because the river holds enough fish to make it worth their time. In 1957, a team from the Natural History Museum lowered sampling equipment into the Thames at London Bridge and recorded zero. Not zero interesting specimens. Zero dissolved oxygen. Zero invertebrates. Zero fish. The river was dead in the way that only a river pumped full of raw sewage for a century can be dead. Technically water, functionally a drain. They published their findings. They formally classified the Thames as biologically dead in its central stretch. The declaration was official, documented, signed. Nobody told the seals. No one told the beluga whale that swam 40 miles from the North Sea to the edge of London in 2018 that the river it was swimming in had been officially classified as dead 21 years before it was born. No one told them the river was supposed to stay that way. What happened between a formal declaration of biological death in 1957 and a beluga whale at the edge of London 6 decades later starts with a Victorian engineer who built sewers too large for a city that did not exist yet. In the summer of 1858, the smell coming off the Thames was bad enough that members of Parliament soaked the curtains of the Palace of Westminster in chloride of lime to survive their own sessions. The press called it the Great Stink. The Thames received the sewage of approximately 2.5 million people directly, with no treatment, along with the runoff from slaughterhouses, tanneries, and gasworks. The water was opaque. The fish were already gone from the central stretch. Cholera epidemics in 1831, 1849, and 1854 had killed tens of thousands of Londoners who drank from it. There is a detail worth pausing on. The cholera deaths were not understood at the time as waterborne. The dominant theory was miasma, the idea that it was the smell itself that made people sick. In 1854, a physician named John Snow had mapped the Soho cholera outbreak to a single contaminated water pump and proved it was the water, not the air. The medical establishment did not fully accept this for another decade. Parliament funded Bazalgette sewers partly to stop the stink, not specifically to stop the disease. By the time the sewers were built for the right reasons, thousands of people had already died for the wrong ones. Joseph Bazalgette was the chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works. His plan was to intercept the sewage before it reached the river and carry it by gravity 12 miles downstream to outfalls east of the city. 83 miles of main sewers, 1,100 miles of street sewers, and 4 major pumping stations. He designed the pipes larger than the calculations required. When his colleagues asked why, he said, "We are only going to do this once, so we had better be right the first time." He added 50% extra capacity for population growth he could not predict. The sewers were completed in 1875. The river improved. By the 1890s, salmon were returning to the lower reaches. The Victorian engineering worked, mostly in the Victorian city. London in 1900 was not the same city. By the early 20th century, London had grown past the population Bazalgette had designed for. The extra capacity he had built in, the 50% buffer his colleagues had questioned, had been consumed by a city that added 2 million people between 1875 and 1920. The sewage treatment technology of the 1870s had not kept pace with a city that now had motor vehicle factories, synthetic chemical plants, and petroleum refining on its banks. By the 1930s, oxygen levels at London Bridge were dropping below the threshold at which most fish survive. By the 1940s, wartime industrial production had made it worse. By the 1950s, the river in its central stretch was, by available measurements, functionally dead. That should have been the end of the story. It was the opposite of the end of the story. Because the collapse in 1957 was not the same as the collapse in 1858. The 1858 problem was a city with no sewer system. The 1957 problem was a city that had built the greatest sewer system in the world, watched it work for half a century, and then outgrown it. The Victorian engineering that was supposed to solve the problem forever had to be solved again, with different technology, by a different generation. The engineer who had said, "We are only going to do this once, so we had better be right," had been right for about 80 years. Then the city caught up with him. Biologically dead is a specific classification, not a metaphor. It means dissolved oxygen content at or near zero. Fish require oxygen dissolved in water to breathe. Below approximately 4 milligrams per liter, most species cannot survive. Below 2 milligrams, practically nothing can. In summer months in the 1950s, dissolved oxygen at London Bridge measured zero. No oxygen meant no fish. No fish meant no seals, no porpoises, nothing above anaerobic bacteria in the food chain. The river moved, it carried water from the Cotswolds to the North Sea, but biologically, in the 40 miles around London, it was an empty pipe. What the 1957 measurements said, in plain terms, was this: London produces more waste than any river can process. The Thames will stay dead unless London becomes a different kind of city. Given the rate at which London was growing in 1957, nobody writing that sentence thought it was about to. In 1964, the Greater London Council began upgrading the sewage treatment works at Beckton and Crossness. These upgrades included new biological treatment processes, activated sludge systems, and secondary processing. By the early 1970s, the biochemical oxygen demand of the river's major inputs was dropping. To track the recovery, scientists began using a monitoring system based not on chemistry, but on creatures. Macroinvertebrates, such as mayflies, freshwater snails, and water beetles, are each assigned a score according to how much oxygen deprivation they can tolerate. A river full of pollution-resistant worms scores low. A river with mayfly larvae scores high. The Thames Biotic Index tracked the recovery in the animals themselves, year by year, species by species, rather than in the water they swam through. The oxygen was coming back. The first fish to return to the Thames was not a salmon. In 1967, a flounder was recorded in the Central Thames, officially the first fish species to re-establish itself in the river since the 1950s crash. It was followed by 19 freshwater species, then by bass and eel working their way in from the estuary. Each arrival was logged, cross-referenced with oxygen readings, and added to the emerging picture of a river that was, section by section, becoming habitable again. In November 1974, a salmon was caught near West Thurrock Power Station on the tidal Thames. The last salmon recorded in the river had been in 1833, 141 years earlier. The oxygen levels had been improving since the early 1960s, but nobody had designed this recovery specifically for salmon. There was no salmon restoration program in place. The Thames Salmon Rehabilitation Scheme, the first official effort to bring the species back, would be established 5 years later in 1979. Partly because of this fish. The salmon had simply followed the oxygen gradient upstream. It had done what salmon always do when the water is right, found its way into a river that had been officially dead 17 years earlier, without knowing that, and without being invited. Nobody planted it in the Thames. Nobody issued a target for it. The scheme that followed, the surveys, the monitoring, the smolt releases, came after the salmon arrived, not before. By 1983, hundreds of salmon were being recorded in the Thames per season. By 1990, 80 species of fish had been documented in the Central River. The salmon was supposed to be the goal. It had arrived 5 years before anyone set the goal. When oxygen comes back to a dead river, it doesn't come back gradually. It crosses a threshold. Once crossed, the cascade moves faster than the models predict. Life comes back not gradually, but all at once, in a way that surprises the people watching. By 1990, 80 species of fish had been documented in the Central Thames. By 2010, more than 115 species had been recorded, including sharks, seahorses recorded at Hammersmith, and Atlantic sturgeon below Gravesend, a fish not seen in the Thames since the 1920s. During the recovery years, the oxygen threshold was still fragile in summer, when warm water holds less dissolved oxygen and bacterial activity peaks. To prevent the central Thames from crashing back below survivable levels during hot spells, the Thames Water Authority deployed oxygenator barges, vessels that injected pure oxygen directly into the river. The first prototype launched in the early 1980s. A self-powered version, the Thames Bubbler, followed in 1988. A third was added in 1999. They operated for decades, maintaining oxygen at a level sufficient for fish to survive the summer months while the deeper recovery continued. The river needed artificial respiration to stay alive while it learned to breathe on its own. The seals followed the fish: grey seals, harbour seals, the occasional elephant seal in the estuary. The Port of London Authority logged 3,000 sightings in 2022 alone. The seals are not visiting. They are feeding. Then the cetaceans. Harbour porpoises in the estuary every year since the mid-2000s. A minke whale in 2001. An orca near the Thames in 2016. And in September 2018, a beluga whale swam 40 miles from the North Sea up the estuary to the town of Gravesend, where it remained for several weeks while marine biologists filmed it from the riverbanks. A beluga whale, in the river that was officially dead in 1957.